Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning into the CAPitalst Cast. Today, I am joined by the House Speaker, Representative Bryan Cutler, who is from Lancaster County. Thanks very much for coming on today. It's fantastic to have you.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. The opportunity to get together again and catch up.
So I guess the first question, let's talk.
Oh, we just lost.
A little bit about you. Can you hear me?
I can now, Leo. You froze there for a good bit.
That was weird. But anyway, the wonders of modern live broadcasting. What I had asked
Technology is great when it works.
It is. It absolutely is. What prompted you to run for office? Let's start there.
Oh, sure. So you want to go way back.
Yeah.
Well, I had the privilege of living and representing the area that I grew up in. And for me, as I grew up, both my parents were sick with Lou Gehrig's disease. So we had a great community, our church, our family, our friends, everybody really pitched in to help my sister and I still have a relatively normal childhood. They would come over and, stay with my parents and help at the house so that we could go to sporting events and youth group and different things like that. And I was always very appreciative of that. And then as I worked my way through trade school and then undergrad at night on the weekends and eventually went to law school, I really wanted to give back to the community that had helped me when I was younger. And it was the opportunity came up to run for the state house, which I did, and really just approached it as approaching the job a little bit differently, I think, than some of my other colleagues here in the House and historically how that was always done. And it really just was a goal to give back to everybody who helped me. And then obviously I was rank and file for a total of 4 terms before I decided to run for leadership. When I was raised, my dad kind of gave me 3 rules to live by, and they still hold true today. And I've talked about them both in my speech as leader after I had assumed that position, and then again as speaker. One is, you never ask somebody to do something you yourself aren't willing to do. And that included serving in government and trying to improve our community. 2 was you always treat everybody with respect, which is something that comes in handy up here because we have a wide variety of beliefs and viewpoints in terms of how to fix things. And then finally, and probably most importantly, you always try to leave things better than you found it. So for me, in many ways, running for office really was a fulfillment of all 3 of those rules.
So you had mentioned you worked your way up through leadership. That's kind of a good segue to what exactly does the speaker do?
Well, the speaker is the oldest statewide office in the Commonwealth. I think it was originally in 1682, if I remember correctly. And I believe I'm the 139th different speaker. So each person as speaker, even if you don't serve contiguous terms, you still are the whatever speaker. But historically, you're always speaker for a window, whatever that is. The speaker is elected from the body of the House, and this is important because as a body, we are not fully constituted until the speaker is elected and in the chair. So for us, on the first Tuesday in January, that means we come in, we are sworn in as representatives, and then the very first order of official business is to nominate and then elect a speaker. The reason that's important is because from December the 1st until whenever swearing in day is, there actually is not someone in the position of speaker. You have the speaker nominee, which each caucus could potentially have one, but you are not officially speaker until you are sworn in as such. And the speaker must be in the rostrum, or the speaker pro tem must be in the rostrum in order to hold session. In many ways, you are the referee of the House. You determine, what amendments are in order. You determine, the order of debate in terms of our individual members abiding by the rules. However, it's unique in that the leaders that are the ones who actually write the rules, the majority minority leader, Democrat and Republican leader. So you're enforcing rules that you may not have had a direct input into. Now, obviously, I had a term as leader, so I helped shape those rules when I was there. But that was something that is a component part of the job. Another part of the job is also we set the session calendar, which historically that typically runs in pretty close to the same 2-year cycle every session with some tweaks as needed. For example, for the budget, if it's not passed on time and goes into July, you would add days, or you could add intervening days. You also decide where the bills go in terms of which committees. We are the referral office. All the bills, and we are working to update this, but currently, the old process is still in use, which is there are multiple paper copies of a bill that are introduced, and they are literally hand carried up to the front. They are read across the desk, which is literally what it sounds. You read them across the desk. They're delivered to the committees. We're looking to modernize that. So we oversee a lot of the institutional functions. We're also looking to modernize our vote boards, our voting system. And in my tenure as Speaker, we also wrestled with the idea of remote session. We had to develop the rules for that. We were one of the first chambers in the country under Speaker Torzai when I was leader to develop a system and a process by which to operate remotely at the early days of the COVID pandemic. And then we ended up actually sharing many of those ideas across the country because other chambers called to see how we were doing it. Additionally, there's also some other institutional functions that we do in terms of overseeing the amendments and determining if they're in order or not procedurally, which we work with the parliamentarian on that. Every day before session, we meet with the parliamentarian to go over what's on the calendar. Now, the leader makes the calendar in terms of what bills do or do not come up on any given day. That was a job that I did for almost 2 years. And in that regard, you kind of sift through everything and provide a little bit of order to the organized chaos that oftentimes is called the House floor. So, and then on the fly, you have to make decisions about motions in terms of which motions are priority motions and how you sift through all of that. And so it's a lot of procedure and institutional decisions in terms of that. The caucuses actually each run themselves. The Republican, the Democrat caucuses both technically report to each of their respective leaders. And the Speaker is really more of an institutional officer in that regard.
So you are really overseeing the day-to-day operations with respect to making sure that the rules are followed, that certain things happen in the order that they're prescribed, basically according to the rules that are adopted at the beginning of each session, thereabouts, plus some constitutional requirements that are also delegated to you, including, if I'm not mistaken, setting up special elections.
That's correct. Now, I have to do it consistent with the laws as they're written. There's a window. I think it's within 10 days of being notified of a vacancy. So unfortunately, when we were notified of Representative Reese's passing, we had to set up that within that window. We do what is called a writ of special election. And unfortunately, I think we've already scheduled 3 in this session, one for Representative Reese and then one for now Senator Flynn, and then also the most recent one with the resignation of a member from Delaware County. We had to set that one up as well. That has to happen within a window. The law dictates how soon it can be called or how late it could be called. Just the way the timing worked for all 3 of those, we just put them on the next scheduled election. One was on the primary and the next 2 will actually be on the general election. Generally, the counties prefer that because then you're not running an additional election in the cycle. And that's their request because that's additional cost, trying to find volunteers on what's traditionally a non-election day. That can sometimes be a challenge. In the Senate, I believe the lieutenant governor is the one who actually calls the special elections.
So in terms of, I want to circle back to the most recent need for calling a special election. And that is because that member was essentially indicted for criminal activity. Over the course of the years that you have been either well, obviously not a speaker, but over the course of time that you've been in Harrisburg, there have been a lot of people who have both either been indicted or convicted of crimes.
Yeah, there has been, and actually, I believe Brad Bumstead has written 2 books, unfortunately, on that very subject. When I first came in back in 2007-8 session, that would have been bonus gate investigation was starting. Was really dominated the first 4 years of my time here. It's very frustrating, as someone who takes this job very seriously and holds not just myself but my own staff to very high standards. It is frustrating when you see individuals abuse that. Now, in regards to their right to a trial and everything else that's constitutionally guaranteed, I recognize those rights, but I do think that it's fair that we hold ourselves to those standards. And as we work forward, my hope is that it becomes less and less of an issue. Hopefully, it becomes a non-existent issue going forward. But until then, I trust that the law enforcement individuals will do what they can. I think that the Attorney General, was involved in many of the high-profile cases that I think you're referencing. But that's part of the checks and balances, and I think it's important to recognize that everybody, both as citizens, the laws apply equally, and that I think that's important as we go forward. And I think that transparency, which is something that I personally have pushed for quite a bit here, in terms of updating the lobbyist laws. I worked for the better part of a decade to increase the fines for individuals who filed false paperwork. That actually dates back to, it was a newspaper article or in a report at the time that someone failed to disclose who they were lobbying on behalf of, and that dealt with the film tax credit. And it was personally very frustrating for me that, there was a couple $1,000 fine levied, which at that time was a very large one. But the truth of the matter is, when you're dealing with multiple millions of dollars in budgetary money and tax credits, I didn't want that to become the cost of doing business. So that was something that we worked the better part of a decade on. It passed the House unanimously 5 times before we ultimately got it, ironically, to Governor Wolf's desk on his first term, and was signed into law. And it highlights the need for that level of transparency. It's one of the reasons, quite frankly, why I've always been very transparent with my own expenses, posting them online from day one, and also always have them available for constituents to stop in and see. Although I'll be very honest, when I had those available in the office, there was only about 3 or 4 people who ever stopped in to see them because they were also online. And I think that was probably the easier route, especially now with, as internet even becomes more available than it was in my early years. So that's something that I think that we have always historically struggled with. And I think Mr. Bumstead does a good job of kind of outlining that in his books. It's sad, though, to me that he had to write 2 volumes.
Yeah. So as it relates to transparency, prior to you coming into office, when your predecessor left, there were, if for anybody who has been in the Capitol, there's actually basically a hall of speakers that has people's portraits, going back a little ways. 3 of the speakers who I believe are currently in the Hall of Speakers have actually been convicted of crimes related to their time in office. There were some plaques that were put up delineating their criminal convictions. Your predecessor actually removed those plaques on his way out the door, essentially. And as far as I'm aware, those plaques have not been replaced. Considering that Pennsylvania has historically seen so many members of the General Assembly ending up in prison, wouldn't it be useful for people who are visiting the Capitol to be made aware of that? Why have those plaques never been put back up?
Yeah, you are correct, Leo, that they were removed prior to me starting. What I can tell you is that information is actually still publicly available. It's in the speaker's portrait booklet that is under all the portraits. And actually, it goes into a little bit more detail than the plaques themselves did. But honestly, I came in the middle of the pandemic. We've been focused on big issues at this point in terms of not just the pandemic, but the overreaction of government, I think, in shutting some of the businesses down and dealing with the unemployment problems that were related to that, the fraud that was in the system. So in terms of what our office has been focused on, honestly, it's been a day-by-day effort just to try to right the ship for a lot of the folks. And I do think that we appropriately draw distinction to that in the booklet itself and go into a little bit better detail in terms of specifics. And I happen to know that because as you transition into the office, you have to sign off on the booklet that's being distributed and do what I'll call a short introductory letter in the front in terms of what the history is. And I think you are correct also that it was 3 previous speakers that were previously convicted. And of those, the details are in that booklet, and their portraits. Interestingly enough, the portraits are actually a modern, more of a modern development. Speaker Matt Ryan actually commissioned, I believe it was Benjamin Franklin and some of the other early speakers to be done because they were not done at that time, and so they were recreations after the fact. But it is important, I think, that you appropriately highlight that. But I also think that in this internet age, I think that everything is readily available as well.
Right. No, and I mean, that's certainly a reasonable point. I would also just point out, though, that the Senate never removed the plaques that were underneath the folks who have been convicted in the Senate. And also, as someone who has personally visited the Capitol numerous times, I have never once read the speaker's booklet. I do, however, walk down the hallway and look at the portraits. And if there were information there indicating, hey, these people were convicted of crimes, it might, when we're talking about the fact that no one is above the law, considering that one of those members is now a registered lobbyist and carrying legislation throughout the Capitol, it might be a good idea to remind people that he spent time in prison for misusing tax dollars. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's a fair point, Leah, but we're going to change the fact that you haven't read that book. I'll make sure you get a copy.
Okay. Yeah. But realistically, when people are visiting the Capitol, having that information front and center does a lot to make sure that folks understand what the history of Pennsylvania is. Because as you mentioned, Brad Bumstead wrote 2 volumes about political corruption in the state. And we continue to be ranked, I believe we're the 5th most corrupt state in the country. So making sure that people, regardless of their age and educational background, are aware that, hey, some not good things have happened here and we're putting it right out in front of you, certainly wouldn't be out of line. And that's just some perspective from people looking at it from the outside. Knowing that we had 2 former speakers literally sharing a jail cell at one point is tragic.
It is. And it really speaks, though, I think, even more so to the moral failings of society. That's something that I think that, that obviously we're struggling with societally as well. There are issues. It's sad to me that, the special election in Philly, I think that there's one seat there that has turned over 3 times because each individual had previously either pled or been convicted of a crime. And it's a sad testament to those circumstances. And I really think, as we move forward on not just transparency and, the issues of government corruption, we also have to deal with it societally in terms of what can we do to improve it. One of the issues that I know that we have struggled with for some time up here is the issue of criminalizing drug addiction and what that means, in terms of criminal justice reform. And we've had an opioid epidemic that I think has been extended 14 or 15 times. And unfortunately, individuals end up in prison where they don't necessarily get the help that they need. And then we act surprised when they return to prison for doing the very same things that landed them there in the first place. It's something that's, I think, much broader than just government, but I also think it is fair to hold those of us in government to higher standards.
So, I mean, kind of moving on from that point, you mentioned criminal justice reform. There have been a couple other topics that you've brought up that kind of, the opioid epidemic being another one, that really, as we look to the fall when the legislature comes back into session, what do you see as being some of the top priorities as far as what legislation will be moving? I know that you don't specifically make those decisions, that's the majority leader that kind of sets up what's going to be voted on when, but what are you seeing as being some of the priorities? I know that the governor, after vetoing the election reform legislation, had something of a change of heart on voter ID, and then maybe he didn't have a change of heart, depending on which news articles you read. But what are we seeing in terms of, the legislation that's going to be moving? Because there's a lot to be done between, September and the end of the year.
Yeah, I mean, really, and I'll use a football analogy if I can, because I know we're getting into football season here. The legislative cycle really can be broken into 4 quarters. You've got the first 6 months, which are, from swearing in to June, or the budget, whenever that happens to get done. Some years it wasn't until August, September, October, November. The next is the fall session, getting ready for the next budget session. And then lastly, the closing session. We're in the second quarter, and I'm going to go back in history and back in time for a little bit, because I think it's important in terms of some of the things that we tackled last session, because it's a continuation this session of many of those very same things. Last session, we passed 648 bills that dealt with a wide variety of issues. We dealt with workforce development, with education, with veterans issues, police and fire issues, the opioid epidemic. And of those bills, 96% were bipartisan and 64% were unanimously passed out of this House. Of those, almost 200 made it to the governor's desk, meaning they passed the House and the Senate. And unfortunately, we also had a record number of vetoes. I think we had 21 last year, if I remember correctly. Most of those disagreements were over areas of the business closure and the pandemic, what I'll call management by the executive branch of government. And those bills, by the way, also had strong bipartisan support. We just never had veto-proof numbers,
right.
And it was somewhat frustrating. But the reason I bring that up is because in response to that, and early this session, we passed for the second time the constitutional amendment to limit the governor's emergency powers. We were the first state in the nation to do so, and our voters approved that with about 53%, I think, approval on the final count. So, by virtue of having passed that constitutional amendment, there are entire sections of the emergency code that need rewritten and updated to reflect the new timelines, 21 days instead of 90, and who has a say when. So we'll be working through all of that through the committee process. I've already seen, some of that information. Some of the other areas are education and workforce development has been a strong push from our caucus in terms of making sure that what we are spending money on in the budget actually represents what our workforce needs are. Employers come to us and say, we need this kind of skill set, or we need these kinds of individuals. We need to make sure that we're properly aligning all of that to meet their needs for 2 reasons. 1, it helps businesses that are here in Pennsylvania, but 2, it also helps fight the brain drain, where we train people to go be good employees somewhere else. So education and workforce development will continue to be at the forefront. You're also I think you will see another run at election law. I know that Chairman Grove has already put a second bill in and is teeing that up to potentially run that this fall. Like you, I saw the governor's change of heart on some of those issues. I tend to be somewhat of an optimist. I think that that a bill that would be agreeable to him could get passed. I'd like to see that so that it would be signed to fix some of the mechanical concerns that the counties have brought up, in terms of the pre-processing of ballots but not counting, because that really is the longest part of processing the mail-in ballots. It's not the actual count themselves, as machines can do tens of thousands per hour. It's opening up the envelope, the outer envelope, verifying that they were a voter, opening up the secrecy envelope, and then straightening out the ballot so that it can be processed. That's what takes a lot of the time. So I think you'll see some things there. I know that on the education front, you're also going to see, a look at the PASHE system, the state system of higher education, and what that looks like, and if they need continued support there in terms of legislative changes. There's also obviously a lot of federal money that's coming in. I, have major concerns about the debt load that the federal government's taking on at this time. But despite my own personal concerns, the government has been given a large amount of those federal dollars, and we need to make sure that there's appropriate legislative oversight on those. So that's not just the budget in general, in terms of health and human services and Medicaid in particular, but also the transportation funding and the infrastructure bill that they're currently working on. What does broadband deployment look at? We had a little bit of a problem at the beginning there with our broadband connectivity. I live in a very rural part of Lancaster County, and broadband is an issue for many of my neighbors. And yet, through the last year and a half, with individuals working from home and individuals dealing, remotely in many cases, broadband really is essential. And we need to work through what those policy issues look like, and not make the same mistake as they did in the 90s, where they provided a lot of incentives and they passed a law, but then they used outdated and old technology to implement that law. It made no sense. We've got a once in a generation chance to get this right, and it's incumbent upon us to do that. I also think you're going to see some real focus on the regional greenhouse gas initiative. There's really two issues there. One's the policy discussion, should the state be or not be in that? But two, and more importantly, is who gets to decide that we go into that? The governor is asserting, I believe incorrectly, that he can unilaterally sign us up. It's our position, and we passed a bill previously, which he had vetoed, that said, no, the General Assembly gets a say in that. Because every other interstate compact that we've ever been entered into, the Delaware River Basin, the Chesapeake Bay Commission, those are all interstate compacts, just like the regional greenhouse gas one that the governor is currently investigating. All of those required legislative approval. Furthermore, in reading the governor's plan on the regional greenhouse gas initiative, there will be a tax or a fee levied, and that will have to go through the appropriations process. So I do think the governor is incorrect in his assertions. Unfortunately, I think that's going to end up in court, given the current calendar that I've seen regarding the way that's advancing through the executive side of the system. But it's a fight that's important because people deserve to have a say. We do have good electricity prices here in the Commonwealth. We want to preserve that. It's one of the reasons, in addition to our great workforce and our great location, that people should want to come here and set up business. Unfortunately, if you enter into that, you look at the other states, that's really a public policy discussion in that, do you want to pay higher prices in exchange for cleaner energy? I don't believe that decision should be made by one person. And so I think you'll see that going forward as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because the Senate had passed with a veto-proof majority legislation by Senator Joe Pittman that is now in the environmental.
I think it's in the ERE committee with Chairman Metcalf.
Yeah. So do you think that that's something that is going to be kind of that will be moving once things come back in, or is it kind of based on how the governor is doing things? Is it going to be like a too little too late kind of thing by the time the General Assembly is back in session?
Yeah, I think unfortunately his timeline is set. I believe there's a consideration the first week or two of September. I know that Chairman Metcalf, he's had several meetings during the break here between the end of budget and the resuming regular session. He is, the committees keep working, and Chairman Metcalf is very, very busy. And in particular on this issue. And I've seen his communications with IRC and the different governmental agencies in regards to his position on that. And I think he'll continue to advance that as we come back, and that could involve up to and including moving legislation. So I do think that will be in the news, so to speak, this fall as we move forward. But it really, to me, it's not a question of Reggie or no Reggie. It's really a question of constitutional powers and who gets to decide that. And I think, unfortunately, the underlying debate on the energy piece sometimes overshadows the more important question of who gets to make those decisions. It's no different than during the pandemic. It wasn't that the legislature thought that the governor was always wrong on how that was being handled. The real question was who was in the room to take part in those discussions, so to speak, and who had the ability to influence those discussions in a positive way. And I'll give you an example. When the business closure orders came out and they seemed somewhat arbitrary, the executive agencies were not in their offices. So it was the legislators who all got the calls. Our office stayed open all through the pandemic. And one of the concerns was you had people making decisions that then weren't responsible for the outcomes. And that created some major issues because, we're still dealing with the fallout from the unemployment problems and who qualifies for unemployment, all because some things weren't properly considered. A good example is, I think everybody remembers the toilet paper shortages that occurred, early on. They said, yes, paper companies can continue to operate, but yet timber companies who harvested the trees to make the paper couldn't. So there was really a fundamental misunderstanding of supply chain. And I think had you had some diverse opinions in the room from across the Commonwealth, somebody maybe from an area that has a strong timber presence, they would have raised their hand and said, well, wait a minute, you only get paper from timber, so they have to be able to work too. And back to the energy piece, coal plants were allowed to operate, but coal mines weren't. You only can make electricity for so long if you don't have further supplies coming in. So I think it's just as important to discuss the process of how those decisions are made as those actual decisions themselves.
Yeah, and I certainly wouldn't disagree. I guess my concern with not having the legislation actually move is that then it gets punted into the courts. And as we saw during the pandemic, just because
not a friendly environment.
The Supreme Court is not a friendly environment for at least what one would consider kind of common sense readings of, either the Constitution or the law. So the more barriers that can be put up to bad policy, the safer it is for Pennsylvanians in general.
Yeah, I would agree with you actually on that, Leo. I mean, I disagree with a lot of the court's opinions and was very public on many of them in terms of not just our pleadings that we put out, but also in terms of actual statements and further interviews on them. There were several what I would refer to as results-oriented opinions. They knew where they wanted to go, so they figured out how to kind of twist the law to get there. And that really bothered me as someone who's really kind of an institutionalist in terms of the not only the separation of powers, but how you interpret the Constitution and just honestly basic statutory construction. We literally had a case where a Supreme Court justice said that the word shall was not mandatory. Every English class and every law class that I was ever in, the word shall is just that. It's mandatory. That was just an absurd reading of the law. I very vigorously disagreed with that assessment. But unfortunately, that was the justice that the voters picked, which is one of the reasons why I've personally supported merit selection previously. I don't know that we should let the arbiters of justice be left up to high name ID or the ability to raise money.
Oh, I think I'm just gonna at the merit selection, I'm just gonna kind of let that pass for a second, Liam, because we do not have time to get into that discussion.
We could do a follow-up sometime.
We could do a follow-up on merit selection because I would absolutely love that, particularly when we can point to some of the people who have been meritorially selected by past governors and this governor to serve open seats.
Fair enough.
On that happy note, I know that you have a very busy schedule. I do appreciate the fact that you took out time out of your day. For everybody who tuned in today live, I appreciate everybody watching, and we will be posting this also on YouTube, and we will make sure to get your office a copy of the video.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Speaker Cutler, for coming on today. It was fantastic to be able to chat with you, and hopefully people got a better understanding of what the Speaker's office does. Again, thanks very much for coming.